Welcome to this Zoom edition of Beyond the Classroom. Our hearts and thoughts go out to all of our first responders and essential workforce who are working so hard to keep us afloat during this coronavirus pandemic. I am so honored that our next guest could join us today for a double version of our show. My guest is one of the founding English teachers of the Science Leadership Academy and holds a master's degree in educational leadership. He is also a proud product of Philadelphia Public Schools. Matthew Kay is the author of the book, Not Light But Fire. Welcome, Matthew.
Thanks for having me.
Such a pleasure to have you here today for a double feature of your amazing book. What was the impetus for writing this book, Matthew?
Well, I've always liked having race conversations in the classroom and found that I was pretty good at it. But I always wondered when I was trying to get better, when I was trying to find something to develop myself, I encountered a lot of information about arguing why we should have race conversations and maybe not as much about how, if you've already been convinced about the why, as I was. And I wanted to make sure that I put a resource out there that kind of helped people like me who are struggling sometimes and doing well sometimes, but always trying to get better at this. And so kind of for teachers, by teachers approach to having race conversations that's not focused on convincing you to have them, but on how to have them better. And so I tried to write that.
And you did an amazing job. The title of the book is a reference to Frederick Douglass's 1852 speech. What is the significance of this, and what led you to name the book after this?
Well, in brief, in 1852, when Frederick Douglass was asked to speak at a 4th of July event, he issued perhaps his most famous and most celebrated speech, where he, what to the American slave is the 4th of July. And I was introduced to that as a freshman in college, and I just fell in love with it. I loved it to the point where I was like, if I ever get a tattoo, I'm gonna get not light but fire put on my arm and stuff like that, because I just loved it. Because what he's speaking about there in that section of the speech was that we're constantly having light shows and we're constantly having these pontificating, showy conversations about race, and nothing actually changes after them. We're always saying we need to have a conversation, but nothing actually changes afterwards. And that was frustrating him, particularly that day, because he was like, because people were always telling him, why don't you try to convince and persuade these people who are enslaving fellow human beings to stop doing that? And he's like, the things you're asking me to do are just for show. We're afraid to have a real conversation about how do we make them do that. And so I've always been inspired by that. It's always, since I was a freshman in college, it's inspired me. But then it really applied a great framework, I think, for this book, because that's the tradition that I'm trying to push. This idea that we don't need to just keep having showy conversations in the classroom that make us feel good, make the kids feel good. But we need to try to have the conversations that convince our kids to live lives of meaning around race things. And so that's where the inspiration came from.
Right, and it's about stepping into the arena, and it's a call to action, right? Stop spinning your wheels around all of the conversation, and let's get into action, and let's get to some solutions here so that we can make this a better place for everyone, and not just talk about it in theory. So I love it. I love it. You say in the book that facilitating powerful and meaningful discussions about difficult topics like race is a skill that teachers can learn and refine through practice. What is the method for doing this effectively, and how do we get it right in the eyes of students?
Well, there's not one way. And I try to make a point constantly in the book about there's not one magic solution, and anyone who's selling one is selling snake oil. Like, I'm not trying to say there's one way to do it. But what I do want to push against is there's this Hollywood image of this typically young teacher who is amazing at developing relationships with kids through magic stuff and their personality, and they're outgoing and they're never shy and all this Hollywood stuff. And I find that that can be really discouraging to some people who are educators, whose hearts are in the right place and they're trying to be great educators, but they're not, freedom writers, dangerous minds, stand and deliver.
Right, right.
They're not that, and they want to know, how can I do this? And I just want to make
Mhm.
sure that everyone has a pathway into these conversations. And if you frame it like a skill, then everyone has a pathway. And that also means that folks don't have excuses. Like, you can't
Right,
say, well, I'm not funny, so therefore, or well, I don't know hip hop, so therefore. Like,
mm,
no one has excuses, because we all can get better at it if we take the framework that everyone can do. It's not just
right,
that one fancy teacher with this superhuman interpersonal intelligence that gets to do it. Um,
right.
yeah,
Yeah, and that makes a lot of sense. I mean, it starts, I think, with courage, right? You have to have the courage to get into the arena, and courage is a skill set that can be taught.
yeah,
So, I feel like that's what you're getting at, which is amazing. You talk about active listening being at the core of getting it right with our students, and um, I feel like that's such an important aspect here. I'm a excuse me, I'm a language teacher, and in a language classroom, listening is one of the least developed skills, but one of the most necessary skills in being able to communicate. And when I'm teaching Spanish in front of my students, they have to listen to understand the language part first. The irony is that once we start putting meaning together and we think we understand the language, that's actually when we stop listening.
yeah.
So it's about listening to understand rather than listening to respond.
Yes, yes. I mean, when you think about it, listening is one of those things that we sometimes ask of kids without being fully aware of how little the outside world prepares them for that. So
Yes.
often success in school is based on how often you participate, how often you talk, how often engage the ideas by you speaking. But and very little of it is based on how well you actually listen to essentially anyone but the teacher. Like, the teacher
Right.
is the only people we train young kids to listen to thoughtfully. And I don't like to speak in absolute. Some people are doing a fantastic job of it, but I think
Right.
systemically we're not really training listening the way we should. And not to mention that the adult world does a horrible job of modeling. If you look at
Yes.
any race conversation that happens anywhere, the adult world is modeling. You say your piece, say it as loud as you can, say it as aggressively as you can, and try to. Each conversation is a battle where you try to get to high ground and never give it up, and listening plays no role.
Right.
So it's really not a mystery that classroom race conversations can be viewed as such a minefield when those are the only models that are really available to us.
Right. Of
But
course.
listening can play such an important role in setting the environment to do it right.
Right. You talk about the safe space, and this is something that I really uh, enjoyed reading about because you said it so beautifully that we as teachers talk about our classrooms being a safe space. We want our classrooms to be a safe place where kids can show up authentically and not be chided for how they're showing up, but be encouraged and nurtured and supported. What do teachers need to do to operationalize this on a daily basis so that meaningful race conversations can take place?
Well, with safe space, I think the biggest point I make in the book is that a lot of us, and again, well-meaning teachers, many well-meaning teachers, we declare a safe space. Like, we say, like on the first couple days of school, you say, "Hello, my name is Mr. K, and I want all of you to to consider this place to be a safe space. This is a safe
Right,
classroom." And we say it, and we assume that because we said it, students will automatically, because of that declaration, feel that way.
right,
Or because we put a sign up on our door, or because we do these kind of things. And those things can be useful. I'm not saying that they're wrong. You should declare it. You should be putting signs up. You should be doing all those things. But we shouldn't think that that's doing more than it's actually doing.
right,
Um, and so in the book, I offer just a few procedures that can make it a normal thing, like the as normal as the comprehension quizzes are in my English class. as normal as any of the other habits that we have, that we make safety something that we are constantly working on and not trying to conjure through magic or declaration. Um, and so I try to be as specific as possible while also within that framework, encouraging teachers to be our creative, awesome selves. Like you don't have to just use my activities, come up with your own activities under this framework that you have to build and maintain a safe space and not just, claim one.
Right, right. And that's what I thought was so beautiful about what you said, because it really is about setting that container of safety daily and mapping out with clarity, what does it look like to be safe? Everyone has their own definition about what it means to be safe in a classroom, right? And how do you work together side by side with your students to come up with what is that going to look like on a daily basis in every activity that we do in the classroom? So I just thought the way you stated it was very beautiful about operationalizing it, not just claiming it. You've got to do more than claim. One of the things that you spoke about with race conversations was what's academic to me is visceral to them. Can you explain a little bit about what you meant by that?
Well, I don't remember the specific example that I referenced there when I say that point in the book. But what I mean essentially is there are certain things that are experienced by someone within a community differently than someone who's outside of the community. So, for instance, in a conversation about street harassment, I can walk the streets of Philadelphia and be fairly certain that nobody is going to harass me. No one's going to try to touch me. No one's going to call me some sort of sexual. No one's going to do that with me. Whereas with my female students, it happens every day. And so for me, when I go to engage that with my students, I need to understand when I approach that though I can care passionately about that, though I can really love them and really have very strong opinions about that, it is not my lived experience in a way where what I know is not equal to what they know. And I need to approach it with that requisite humility so that I don't overstep myself. Same thing often as a white educator working with children of color. It's the same thing. It's like you can love them, you can have passionate political opinions about what they're going through, you can volunteer at certain places, you can do this, that, and the third, but that does not mean that you are experiencing it the same way. And it's academic to you and visceral to them. I speak about sometimes as a person of color, I've been frustrated in the presence of some white people who I really admire and love because, to be honest and frank, I don't want to discuss it with them that day because I don't want to have to deal with you answering. I'll say it this way. I don't want to have to occupy my brain space trying to manage your emotions and your feelings and your reactions to what I'm saying. Because the thing was about me. It wasn't about you. It was about me. So it's just easier for all involved for me to speak within the family on that. And a lot of times our students feel the same way. They're like, I don't have anything against you. I don't really want to talk about this with you. And it's hubris for you to think that I have this burning desire to discuss gentrification or police brutality with you. We're not family. But that said, as an educator, that is something we have to deal with because that can't make us avoid things. So it's a balance. We have to figure out how can we find a way to build the relationships enough with the students, knowing that we'll never fully get to be family, but we can get close enough to engage some family type issues. And so that's what I mean by us reflecting on what is academic to us and visceral to our students. And what is academic to some students and visceral to other students who are in that same room. If you're discussing COVID right now in a classroom virtually, some of your students, it may be an academic issue. Some of your students might have a parent who's suffering from it. Those are two different levels of engagement on the issue. And so we as a teacher, we have to be aware of that.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Let's talk about burn 5 minutes, good news, and high grade compliments. Explain what these are and how they contribute to genuine house talk relationships in the classroom.
Well, that's all those things relate to my previous answer. So those three activities were um, pretty much they represent my attempt to get close enough to a family type of relationship so I can have some of these conversations. Just not just between me and my students, but between my students and each other, where they get to the place where they through these activities and others that teachers imagine through these activities they can get close enough with each other to basically if you've just built a relationship with someone from sharing good news and compliments regularly systemically in your classroom, it's a little harder for you to 5 minutes later make a snap accusation about
Right.
someone being racist or someone having the worst possible intentions when you just built with them about something else. It creates an environment where everyone's willing to cut each other a little bit of slack
Right.
and maybe listen a little bit more eagerly than accuse. It's not
Yes.
a miracle. It doesn't mean there will never be confrontations. It doesn't mean, but it means you're just working to buttress your environment to make it so it can withstand those confrontations a little bit easier. Um,
Right.
yeah,
Yeah, and that makes sense to me. Again, you're talking about the container building, and what we're all wanting is to be seen and to be
mm-hmm,
heard and to be respected and accepted for who we are, right? And so by spending 5 minutes and talking about good news and giving genuine compliments, who doesn't want to receive a genuine compliment? And it creates a sense of belonging in a classroom that then when things do come up and conflict does come up, you have something to fall back on. That's kind of, you've set the foundation of the tone rather than there not having been anything of substance to build.
absolutely. I do have to say, because I always say, high grade compliments and good news were created by Zach Chase. That's a
Okay.
colleague I used to work with. He's a good friend of mine. So
Okay.
I never want people to say that I come up with them. I saw basically my framework was, or my idea was, uh, students in my class liked me a lot. Um, Students in his class liked each other a lot. And
Okay.
so when I visited his classroom, I'm like, my classroom's a cult of my personality. His classroom was a community and a classroom of love. And I was like, he's doing this better than I am. What is he doing? And so I just want to
Yeah.
make sure I shout him out anytime I
Yes,
mention those activities.
absolutely.
Those are his activities, not mine.
Absolutely. That's awesome. Orienting students to a racial conversation is a tricky business that requires careful balance, you mentioned in the book. What does that balance look like?
If you are so orienting students to a conversation is just this is your prep work, right? It's like how do you get them ready to engage it thoughtfully and meaningfully, um, and it's a balance in many ways. The balance I'd focus on is how do you know what to front load and what not to front load. Like
Mhm.
sometimes there's a movement in education, or there was a while back. I don't tend to keep up on too many of these things, but where you could not engage a lot of the meaningful stuff until you got this basics. You got to go back to the basics. You got to make sure that they understand certain things. What that means in a conversation is they have to have all of this historical background
Mhm.
of an issue before they can engage it in a way where they're discussing controversies and stuff like that. And that's not how my brain works. But it's also not absolute. They do need some background knowledge in order to engage it. So what I talk about in the book is just trying to figure out um, like what that balance is. Because I've seen so many conversations and I've had so many in my classroom been ruined because I over front loaded it in my orientation.
Oh, okay.
And I've had conversations ruined because they didn't have enough context, so um, they didn't know that the conversation they're having has a history,
Okay.
which I think is so important. Like if you're talking about issues about appropriation, like that didn't just come up. The issues around blackface, they did not just come up. These are existing debates. These are existing things. And it helps for kids to have some historical context. So it's not just, I feel this, I feel that, I feel that.
Right.
It's more kind of like, what does the research say? So it can be more
Yes.
academic. So it's a balance. We try to, we do the best we can to work it out.
Right. And I mean, sometimes, like you said, you're going to over front load or you're going to under represent the research, and it's you have to be willing to put yourself out there and try different things, and also cut yourself some slack that you're not always going to get it right, you know,
No.
and trying to step back and figure out, okay, well, what worked, what didn't, and let's move forward.
Yeah.
Yes, definitely. There are many teachers who feel that it is taboo to offer up opinions on academic topics to ensure that we're actually really empowering our students and teaching our students how to think for themselves. What is the line for teachers in expressing their own opinions?
I mean, there's not one line. What I speak about in the book mostly is that we have to, well, I'll put it this way. It's not our job to proselytize our beliefs to our students, right as they may be. That's not what we get paid for. That's not our job. Our job is to teach them. Our job is to make them better thinkers and better citizens and better, you know, all of those things. It is not to make little clones of us as brilliant as we are. And so that has to be at the forefront of any time we are asked by the students to share our opinions on something we're discussing, is that we have a lot of influence in that space. And so a lot of us kind of overcorrect on that and say, they'll push back and they'll say, you know, a kid will say, Mr. K, what do you think about this? And I'll say, I don't know, what you think? And I've discovered after talking to kids that a lot of times that annoys them like greatly. They're like, I have expressed a need and you are not honoring that need. I respect you as a thinker. I respect you as this. Sometimes it's like, get over yourself. I'm not saying because you share something, I'm going to believe it. I just really want to know what you think. You're older than I am. You've experienced some things I haven't experienced. What do you think? And sometimes if we don't share, all we're showing is we're not listening to you. We don't value the request that you made. At the same time, we need to make sure that we do recognize our power in the classroom and that when we share our opinions, it's not to proselytize. It's to push thinking. So you can spar with kids, but your job isn't to knock them out. Your job is to spar with them. Your job is to tease out their thinking. Your job is to make sure that they're rooting their things in facts. Your job and you modeling that as a lead scholar in the room I don't see a problem with that.
Right. Again, it's a skill that has to be fine-tuned and worked on. Yes, definitely. You talk about classroom management versus conflict management. What tips do you offer teachers who are afraid that having race conversations in their classrooms will be a possible free-for-all?
Well, there are many. I guess I can't give away all the goods in a couple minute answer, but I think if you pay close attention to chapter 3 of the book, and you're talking about curriculum, and they will not be a free-for-all if it's rooted in a thoughtful curriculum. If every race conversation you have is just an emotional thing that you brought in that day because you were angry about something, or because you read a new book, or because, you know, any of the other catalysts that I speak about in the book, then you run a higher risk of those kind of mistakes happen. But if it's rooted in a curriculum that is, you know, and you don't make an enemy out of your state standards and Common Core, but you try to root everything in those things, you'll be surprised at how often those race conversations can be fruitful and meaningful when we take this mindset that we have to be renegades out. Like, we can actually be very thoughtful. Race is a thoughtful lens to engage many of the texts that we encounter. And it's a powerful lens. And when you use race as a lens, it's not a free-for-all, it's teaching.
Mm-hmm. Right.
That doesn't mean it's perfect, but it's if you are less random as a teacher, your classroom dynamic will be less random.
Right. And that is something we're going to go into in part 2, a little bit more about how to select curricular materials that do serve as a nice framework for race conversations to happen and not turn into a free-for-all. So thank you for bringing that up. My last question for the first section is about professional practice. One of the things that I liked about the book was that you talk about how do teachers then take this back and start to make a professional practice of it. And I actually think it goes much broader than just educators. I think it's workplace just in general. We all know that whatever changes we're wishing to see in our classrooms must begin with us. What are some ways in which faculty meetings can set the foundation for how to have difficult conversations?
I think, you know, at the end of every chapter, like you mentioned, I try to pivot. I mean, every chapter in the first half of the book, I try to pivot towards things that, ways that we can develop ourselves to do some of the things that were mentioned in that chapter. But I think the biggest thing is we tend to treat our students the same ways that we are treated in our staff meetings. If we're not listened to, we tend to bring that not listening spirit into our classroom. If everything's very top down, et cetera, a lot of the behaviors that are, we tend to bring energy from one space to the other.
Right.
If we feel like we have to close the door to do good teaching, which I hear a lot of times, that impacts how we engage kids.
Absolutely.
You know, if we feel like we have to not smile till December because an elder on the staff told us to do that, or because someone, that has its impact on kids. So I think the simplest way to answer that, it's way more complex, but the simplest way to answer that is the adult relationships in the building need to be worked on as much as our relationships with young people.
Thank you so much. And we are going to continue our fabulous conversation with Matthew Kay on the second episode of Beyond the Classroom. This is Diana Ahl reminding you to always take learning beyond the classroom. Welcome to this Zoom edition